Good day, yogis. So today we're going to do a yin yoga sequence for the hips. It's going to exclusively target your hip joint in its 6 available degrees of movement. So a real quick recap, your healthy hip socket has 6 different ways that it can move. Those 6 ways are hip extension, hip flexion, external and internal hip rotation, and then abduction and adduction. So this yin yoga sequence that I've designed exclusively to move us through those 6 degrees of movement of the hip is going to allow you to see how good your range of motion is in each of those 6 degrees of movement, and then obviously identifying where you maybe have some limitations in that range of movement, and then knowing the kind of movements that you can incorporate more into your daily life to help improve those ranges of motion. As always, when we are doing yin yoga, we are really focusing on the fascial network of the body more so than muscles. So we're going to really want to become a very passive individual in our musculature and really focus on becoming still. And it's those long held stresses of the fascial tissues that are going to improve our range of motion. It's not about getting strong. It's about bringing in hydration into those fascial tissues and allowing them to have the ability to smoothly glide past each other. Often what people think of as knots in their muscles, it's not their muscles at all. It's the fascia wrapped around the muscle. Your fascia is everywhere. It's around every muscle fiber. It's around every muscle fiber bundle, and it's around every muscle in its entirety. Not to mention we have some amazing lines in the body that help us with stability and endurance and strength and stabilization. So those are fascia trains. So all you need to really remember is the longer you hold a pose and the stiller you get and the more passive you get through your musculature, then the more you're going to actually be able to target those tissues that are more responsible for flexibility and greater range of motion, and ultimately limiting the amount of pain that you can feel in your body. For today's practice, a couple of things to have handy: a yoga strap, a couple of blocks, a bolster if you have one. I realize not everybody at home has a yoga bolster. You can substitute with a pillow or a cushion, or for sometimes you can just use the block. I also recommend highly that you either sit on a folded up blanket, or perhaps you have what I like to call a sit cushion. Again, you can substitute with a blanket or with a cushion from your house. We are going to get started. So put on some music that you enjoy listening to, and let's get started. So we're going to start on our backs. And as always in any yoga practice, regardless of what type of yoga it is we are doing, we want first to make a connection with our body and our breath. So coming into either full Shavasana here, with the legs fully extended, shoulder blades released to the earth, palms turned up to the sky, grounding through the back of your hands. If this does not feel good in your lower back, you can take Ardha Shavasana, which is bending the knees and planting the feet. So find whichever of those 2 positions works best in your body. And perhaps closing your eyes here. And if that's not comfortable, then just soften your gaze, maybe down to the very tip of your nose. And we're just going to start to explore our inner spaces. So I want you to take a scan through your body and check in where you are holding onto physical tension in the body. So everything we experience throughout our days or our weeks or even our years is held in the body, unless we learn how to let it go. So yoga is obviously a very good practice for helping you to release emotions memories, experiences that gets trapped and stored in our bodies. As adults, there are a couple of holding storage spots. So let's check in with those. So unclench the back teeth. We want that lower jaw to relax away from upper jaw. The mouth does stay closed. The lips are soft. And we're going to let the tongue just relax into the lower palate of the mouth. And let's check in with that little space right between your eyebrows. This is often where people have the number 11 permanently furrowed into their forehead. So let's just think about eyebrows moving away from each other towards the direction of your ears, smoothing out the worry lines on the forehead. Another big tension holding spot in the body is the tops of the shoulders. A lot of us walk around with our shoulders wearing them just like a pair of earrings. So tops of shoulders moving away from ears. Let's create space between shoulders and ears. A couple more places in the body where we tend to store some stress. Through the belly itself. Culturally, we're told to always suck in our gut, especially in the West. That isn't the greatest body position that you can maintain over time. So some people have really tight bellies. And obviously when we breathe, we use belly breath. So we want that belly to be soft and able to move. And then lastly, just give a little wiggle of your hips side to side, and let's just release into that lower back. So we're giving our body permission here to release and let go. Let's take one more scan through the body, different intention this time. We're just going to check in with areas of the body where maybe there's some pain, maybe you have an injury, something's in healing mode, or maybe you just have a limitation. I just want you to become aware of those areas of the body that may need greater care and attention as we go through the practice. Your body is always talking to you in the form of physical sensation. So sharp, stabbing, shooting, burning, electrical signals are the body saying, no, we want to be listening to that. So let's focus now in on our breath. Our breath is the guide to the practice. It's what keeps us safe physically and what helps our mind to stay focused on something other than all the crazy thoughts that can run through your head. So keeping the mouth closed, I want you to bring all your awareness into the nostrils and just starting to observe the flow of air moving in and out of the nose. And so there's no need to change the breath here. We don't have to correct anything because we're not judging the breath. We're just observing air flowing in, air flowing out. Now, as we bring our awareness into the breath, we automatically start to breathe better. So our breath starts to smooth out, starts to slow down. And of course, what we're looking for is a diaphragmatic breath. So again, often called belly breath. So once you start to feel the belly moving with the breath, you know your diaphragm is in place. So you are already breathing better. Let's shift the awareness from the nostrils to the belly itself. If you have a hard time connecting with that movement of the belly, just place your hand over navel. And for some people, the belly movement can be very subtle, doesn't have to be big. And I definitely don't want you to manipulate it or try to control it. So breath is always primary in any yoga practice. Poses are secondary to the breath. At any time in this practice, if you need to come out of a pose, please do so. And just return back to this breath awareness practice right here. This is still yoga. So already noticing how little time it takes for that breath to really slow down. Breath cycle lengthening out, decreasing our respiratory rate. And the breath will continue to change. The more we marinate in these yin postures, the exhale will actually start to lengthen and get longer than the inhale. So that's what takes us and anchors us into our good nervous system. It's going to be very important as we hold these yin postures and try to find our stillness, that the mind is something to anchor onto. So tell your mind now, it has one job only: watch the breath. You're going to have to redirect it many times, and that's just part of the practice. Last few breath cycle observations here. So telling yourself now you're going to keep your awareness on this breath. You're going to stay in these diaphragmatic breaths, knowing that at any time, if you leave the diaphragmatic breath, that is a really good signal that you're pushing your body too hard and you need to dial it back. All right, let's bend back through the knees, those of us who extended our legs, and come back into Ardha Shavasana. I suppose we're going to think about it as a neutral position. And we are going to take one of our blocks now and lift up the hips enough that the block can slide in under the sacrum. Sacrum is at the very base of your spine. It's a triangular bone. It's fused vertebra. And I just want you to make sure that the block, if you're using the block, is not too high up into your lower back and it's not too far down into your glutes. It's ideally in the middle. You should feel that hard sacrum resting on your block. Now, if you put the block in place and you go, yuck, in your lower back, this is not for me, that's fine. Take the block out and you're going to do the postures without the block. Those of us who use the block are just going to get a little bit more hip extension because we've elevated the sacrum. Walk your heels back towards your glutes, whether you have a block in place or not. Shoulder blades release to the earth, tops of the shoulders away from the ears. This is our neutral position because our hip flexors, which we're just about to target, have come into sort of a switched off position. They're not in flexion, they're not in extension. And so it's here that any stored tension in the hip flexors can be encouraged to release and let go. Now we're going to move into our first posture. It's called half pontoon. You're going to draw your right knee in towards your chest and either interlace your hands around the front of the right knee or hold the knee in place using a strap. I want you to be really soft through the right hip flexors themselves. So right into this right hip crease, nice and soft and passive. Tucking your chin here. Let's make sure that the chin is not lifting up towards the sky. We want the chin and the forehead on a level plane. If that's really hard for you to do, slide a blanket in under the back of your head. So we've just brought our right hip into passive hip flexion. Remember, 1 of 6 degrees of movement. But our actual real target here is hip extension. So now we're going to start to walk the left heel away from us. And it may be that you can fully extend that right leg and just anchor into your heel bone. Those of you who have really tight hip flexors, you might have some feedback coming from your lower back that says, no, do not extend the leg. If that's you, you're going to keep a slight bend through the knee, or maybe you have to keep a bigger bend through the knee.
You want to be able to find a position where you are not stressing the body, as in you cannot breathe into this. If you cannot breathe, inhale and exhale into the posture, there is something going on in the body that needs some attention. So dial it back. Dialing it back here would be bending through that straighter leg or taking that block out from under the sacrum. This is our half pontoon pose, and this is the pose we're now going to marinate in. Bring your awareness back to your breath. Make sure the breath is flowing. Anchor the mind onto the breath. The only muscles in the body that's doing any real work here are our biceps. Holding that knee in place. Everything else in the body should be becoming very passive. I want you to ask yourself, how could I make this more easy to do? Less effort required. If holding the knee in with the hands is just a little bit too much straining, use your yoga strap. If the chin wants to lift up to the sky, slide a blanket in under your head. In yin, we like to use lots of props. So here's where the magic happens. It's in this marinating or holding stillness in the posture. This now is where we're actually applying different stressors to the fascial tissues. So we're targeting our hip flexors. There's 3 of them. And one of them is called your psoas, and I have a whole separate practice just on that target. So that's another practice that you will be experiencing. We just go a little bit deeper. We just target things a little differently. So if time is the magic ingredient in a yin posture, that means we want to hang out there long enough that we start to reap benefit. So when we hold these postures and we bring our body into stillness and we bring the appropriate stress into the tissues itself, different things start to happen in the body. So we start to produce a lot of hydration. Hyaluronic acid molecules pull water into those tissues, start to hydrate them. Stay with your breath. We're going to be here for 1 more minute. Really try to encourage yourself on those exhales just to soften and surrender. Last few breaths here. Let's slowly walk the left leg back into where we started. Nice and slow, we're not in a hurry here. And then release the right leg down beside the left, back to our neutral. Just take a little pause here between the sides. Adjust your block if necessary. Make sure it's still under the sacrum. And just to notice any sensations that may arise from releasing that posture. And now we will draw the left knee in. So again, really soft through the hip flexors. Keep soft through that hip crease. Interlace hands or use a strap. So drawing left knee towards the chest. And then start to walk the right heel away. Maybe you fully extend and anchor onto that right heel. Feedback zone is the same as the lower back. There should be no sharp stabbing, pinching sensations here. If there are, you need to modify. You need to dial it back. Walk the right leg back a bit. Find your edge. That's our first principle of yin. So an edge is somewhere where we start to maybe feel some resistance in the body. We start to notice some sensations building in the body. Most sensations feel achy. That's our fascia talking to us. That's our tightness or our dehydrated tissues. And we just make sure that this edge that we found allows the breath to flow freely. There's no impediment to that exhale. So second principle of yin is find your stillness. This is where it becomes really important just to anchor that mind back onto the breath. Give it something to do. Third principle, of course, is time. The longer we stay here, more stress builds in the tissues. More benefits will accrue by those tissues getting more hydration. And take a quick little body scan here and ask yourself, where am I holding tension still? Where can I let go? How do I make this effortless? One more minute here on this side. Thirty more seconds. Last few breaths here. So again, walk rocking that right leg back, nice and slow, back to starting position. Releasing left leg down beside. So there is our hip extension through both hips together. Now we've been keeping our back in extension also, so those of us who have the block in place just want to lift the hips up enough, pull the block out nice and slow, release that sacrum back to the earth, and then extend both legs long down your mat. I'm just going to take a few breaths here in some stillness. So hip extension, hip flexion. There we were. 2 degrees of movements just in that half pontoon on either side. So let's bend back through the knees now. Come back to our Ardha Shavasana. And we're going to start with hip external rotation. So we're going to draw the right knee into the chest just enough that we can bring the right ankle onto the right thigh. And the first thing we want to do is set up this pelvis that it's neutral so we can isolate this hip. Fingers to those bony landmarks at the very front of your pelvis. There's these jutting out bones at the very top, front of the pelvis. It's the ASIS joints. And we just want our pelvis to be neutral, so same level height from side to side, no tipping. And we also want our hips to be the same height. So some of you might have dropped the right hip to get that right ankle on left thigh. So draw the right hip back up if you did that. Now that we know our neutral pelvis position is in place, we can take a right hand on the inside of the right knee and start to push the knee away from you, keeping pelvis neutral. So I usually keep one hand on my belly, and then I'll know if I'm starting to move my pelvis. So we're just going to isolate this right hip socket. This is external rotation. Some people have a lot. Okay, I have a lot of external hip rotation. Other people might only be back here. Some people have very little external hip rotation. I want you to find your maximum hip rotation, and we're going to call this level 1. So if you're a person whose knee does not open out much, you have very little external hip rotation, I want you to stay in step 1 because this is where you need to be. If you're like me and you have a lot more, or maybe a lot altogether, you might go into step 2, which is clasping hands around the back of the left thigh, or use your strap. I tend to use my strap because I find my hands are just too slippy to interlace the fingers. Now step 2 adds on hip flexion. Now if you're back here in step 1, it doesn't matter that we just added in hip flexion because you already did it in your last postures. If you can bring in that hip flexion, great. What's most important here is finding that external hip rotation. The hip flexion is just an add-on. Now, if you've gone to step 2, I really want you to check in with your shoulders. They might have creeped up to your ears. Don't let that happen. And you might have your chin lifted to the sky. Don't let that happen. Tuck the chin or slide a blanket in under the back of the head. Forehead, chin, level plane. So external hip rotation here in either level 1 or level 2. There is a level 3, which is taking the left foot up to the sky, but it must stack right over top of the hip, not over here. That doesn't do your lower back any good whatsoever. So if that's you, please don't go to level 3. Please stay at level 2 or come back to level 1. Once you've found where your edge is in either level 1, 2, or 3, we're now going to try find some stillness. Come back to the breath. So why is external hip rotation important? Well, it's 1 of 6 degrees of movement your hip is supposed to be able to do. If you're a person who sits in a chair a lot, or if you're a person who maybe is a very active walker or runner, you're not going to have a lot of external hip rotation unless you're naturally built to do so. Chairs especially are really bad for the hips because when you're sitting in a chair, the only real thing that's happening in your hip is hip flexion. Let's do 30 more seconds here on this side. Last few breaths wherever you are. Alright, if you're in level 2, you're going to release your hold on the back of the left thigh or the strap. And we are going to release that right ankle from the left thigh. Come back to Ardha Shavasana, come back to our neutral. And then draw left knee in enough so that left ankle can now come onto the right thigh. Hands back to those bony landmarks, front of the pelvis. Let's check. Pelvis is level from side to side. And if you dropped the left hip, draw it back up so hips are the same height. Now, with a neutral pelvis, we'll take our left hand on the inside of the left knee and start to push the knee and the shin away more towards the top of your mat. So, you can be very different from side to side in your body. Not everyone is perfectly symmetrical. In fact, I think it's probably really challenging to find anyone that is symmetrical from side to side. So you might be able to identify here which side has more external rotation. Find your maximum external rotation and stay either here in level 1 or hands clasped or use a strap around the back of the right thigh this time, drawing lower body back towards upper body. This is level 2. Check in with the tops of the shoulders, tuck the chin. And if you're going to level 3 and you're taking that right foot up to the sky, make sure it's stacked right above your hip. If it's not, don't do it. There's no benefit to that. So making sure our body is not holding on to tension anywhere it doesn't need to. Try to limit the amount of muscular involvement we have happening here. Come back to that breath. Make sure the breath is flowing. And we'll do 30 more seconds here. Nice and slow, those of us in level 2, release. And level 1, all of us now releasing the left ankle from the right thigh. So we're going to move from reclined swan, which was what each of those sides were, into reclined butterfly. And we're going to bring both hips into external rotation this time. So we're just going to let the soles of the feet come to touch as the knees open out to each side. Shoulder blades release to the earth, tops of shoulders away from the ears, arms wherever is comfortable for you. So here we have external rotation through both hips. Now, if it's really hard for you to release through your inner thigh area and your inner leg line, please bring in a block and support under each hip. So a supported body can release and relax better than an unsupported body in the majority of cases. If you've been doing yin for a while, then you're probably used to just letting, in this case, the knees hang out in midair, but you're not gripping through the inner thighs. Our target zone here, in addition to this external hip rotation, we are targeting that inner leg line through the inner thigh area and groin. But we don't want to activate those muscles. You just want to let everything release and surrender. More seconds here. If you have blocks under the thighs, take the blocks out. Hands underneath the thighs now. We're going to support those knees up to touch. We're going to keep the knees touching and walk our feet out as wide as the edges of our mat. This is now a counter pose, and we're bringing those hips into internal rotation. We'll just spend a minute here breathing in this counter pose for the hips. Don't forget, redirect that mind back to the breath as many times as you need to. Last few breaths here. All right, we're going to walk our feet back into Ardha Shavasana. And pause here for a moment. So we're going to work into internal rotation now from a supine position, so on our back. And we're going to do what is essentially a reclined deer pose. So you're just going to walk your feet as wide as the edges of your mat now. So your knees are apart and your feet are as wide as the edges of your mat. And we're going to start with some windshield wipers. So you're just going to drop both knees over to the right, draw them back through center, and then drop them over to the left. So there's the flow. And this is internal and external rotation through those hip sockets. So this is sort of like as oiling and lubricating the hips here. And don't be trying to be in a hurry. We're just getting some nice, smooth, fluid movements here. So nothing quick or jerky. And as we do this, these windshield wipers, you're also getting nice little rotation and twisting into your spine. The next time your knees are over to the right, I want you to keep them there. We're going to call this level 1 of the reclined deer. This left hip just internally rotated. For some people, this is quite enough internal rotation, and this is where they'll stay. Or level 2 is going to bring that right ankle up on top of the left thigh, just above the knee. Not on the knee itself, just above. What that does is it adds a little bit more load, so this left hip internally rotates more. Your right hip is externally rotating. There's even one more level, that's level 3, and that would be to bring the left heel closer to your glutes. What you'll notice then is that brings a lot more extension into your lower back. So for some people that's not ideal, you would just walk the foot back to level 2. You have the option here to turn your head to the left. Only if that feels okay in your neck. If it doesn't, keep looking up to the sky. So internal rotation of left hip, external rotation of the right. Little bit of extension into the lower back if you're in level 2 or 3. Back to your breath. Any more seconds here. Head back to center. If you're in level 3, I want you to walk that left foot back to level 2. If you're in level 2, you're going to remove that right ankle from the left thigh. And then all of us, nice and slow, are going to bring those knees back up through center and then over to the left. And then back up through center and over to the right. So we're going to go back into another series of windshield wipers. Just going to help distribute some of that hydration that we brought into those hip sockets. Distribute it from a more superficial level of the fascia down into deeper fascia. So There are many, many different types of fascia in the body. There's many different classifications. There's deep, there's superficial, there is regular striation of connective tissue, there's irregular striation, there's specific little fascia bands in the body, thicker groups of fascia called aponeuroses. There are many, many different classifications. So the thing is, though, is that all of these different types of fascia all respond to the same stresses. It's just our body has different types of fascia throughout, depending on what the actual job is of that particular fascial unit. All right, next time your knees are over to the left, you're going to keep them there. This is level 1. Right hip just internally rotated. Left hip externally rotated. You could try level 2. Left ankle up on top of the right thigh above the knee. You could try level 3, walking right heel closer to right glute. This brings a lot of back bending into your lower back. If that doesn't feel good, walk the heel back to level 2 position. Option to turn your head to the right this time, unless that does not feel good in your neck, in which case just keep looking up to the sky. So targeting this right hip for internal rotation. Come back to your breath. Remember, once again, if anytime you need to come out earlier than I cue you, please listen to your own body. So the only sensations you should be experiencing as we marinate in these yin postures is achiness. Right? It's like a deep toothache in the body. You can breathe into it. Your exhale is not effective. Any other sensations that either take the breath away, or if there's tingling or numbness, you need to come out. Or you need to slightly just dial it back a little bit. If you're in level 2, you'd go to level 1. Always do what your body is asking you. Don't stay in something that your body is not happy with, because you're going to just move into your fight or flight nervous system, and there's no benefits to be gained from that nervous system. In order to reap benefits of any yoga, you need to be in your good nervous system. Rest, digest, repair mode. We're going to do 20 more seconds here. Okay, if you're in level 3, walk that right foot back to level 2. If you're in level 2, release the left ankle from the right thigh. And then all of us from level 1, nice and slow. It might ache a lot coming out of this. Come back to knees through center, over to the right. And we'll go back through a series of windshield wipers once again. Just trying to redistribute some of that hydration that we just built up. So I always like to think of this as like taking an oil can to your hips. If you were like the Tin Man out of Wizard of Oz, and you know how he needs oil to keep his joints moving, well, we kind of do too. Our oil is built from the inside. You can't externally apply it, but we can make our own hyaluronic acid molecules, and we can bring in more moisture to our tissues. So hyaluronic acid is in every face cream going now on the market. It's what? Those fillers that are pumped into your face. Should you choose to do that, that's hyaluronic acid. Your body can make its own. Unfortunately, it's harder to target it through the face, though there is something called face yoga. I'm not trained in that, but I've thought about it, because your face is just made up of muscles and fascia like everything else. Alright, next time your knees are back through center, keep them there, and we're just going to roll over onto one side of the body, doesn't matter which. And we're going to come into fetus pose. So I just want you to do a check-in here. Check in with the body, check in with the breath. So we've been lying on our backs for a while, so just before we bring ourselves to an upright position, it's good to just sort of take a halfway approach. Some people have vertigo, some people have blood pressure issues, and we just need to find a little bit of stabilization. And then support yourself up to seated. So we are going to do some of those same targets, but from a seated position. So what does that do? That just changes everything up, because when we come to a seated position, we end up bringing our upper body weight over top of the hip setup. So it actually gets a little bit more difficult. So using your blanket or your sit cushion, bringing your sit bones right to the very front of that sit cushion or blanket, and we're going to go into our seated butterfly. Now, if you have a bolster at home, you can use it, but for butterfly you don't have to have anything. And I'll show you different variations. So soles of feet together, knees apart. Again, if you feel really uncomfortable with the knees hanging out in midair, you can bring in blocks and you can support underneath those thighs. So now you can really let go. External rotation again, back into our hip sockets, opening them out. Back, targeting the inner leg line, thigh and groin. If you have a bolster or a cushion, you could hug it right into your midline here, and then you would round and fold over top of that bolster or cushion. Or maybe you need to keep your spine straighter, as in a neutral position, because you have bulging herniated discs. Therefore, you would I like to just put the bolster onto my feet and then support my forehead at the other end of the small end of the bolster. Or maybe you can bring yourself folded right down and support your head onto the bolster itself. So there's many different variations. I personally don't like using a bolster at all. I have a very short upper body. I don't get a lot of forward folding when I have the bolster tucked right in. So what's most important in our butterfly is that our hips are externally rotated, and then we're going to take a forward fold. So again, if you have bulging herniated discs, you should never forward round. You could hinge though and keep the spine straight. If you don't have that condition to worry about, you can come with me, whether you use a bolster or not, and starting from a nice tall spine, you're going to tuck your chin, and then you're going to round through your upper back, palms turned up, And here's our butterfly. So same positioning of the hips themselves within the pelvis, but again, we've got this upper body weight now centered over top of the pelvis. That changes how we stress the tissues. If you're taking the forward fold and rounding, we're also working into the big tissues through the back. So as always, we just want to check the breath is flowing. Just want to ask ourselves, where do we need to release tension? So seated butterfly is a nice pose because we can really start to turn inwards a bit more here. And just really anchor into your breath. Let's just do 30 more seconds here. Last few breaths. So coming out of this butterfly, we want to just nice and slow uncurl ourselves. We're keeping our chin tucked to the very, very end. So releasing head and neck, very last things, back into alignment with the spine. Take your hands underneath each knee and draw the knees up to center and then extend the legs down your mat. Hands back behind your hips and take a little shake out here. All right, so we are going to go into our last 2 degrees of movement for the hips. Abduction and adduction. We're going to start with adduction first. So this is the hips moving away from the center line. So taking your legs as wide as comfortable for you. You should not be feeling overly stretched through your inner thigh or groin. If you have a bolster, you'll bring it right into the center of your legs. Or if you have a cushion or a big rolled up blanket as a substitute. And again, if you don't have any of those things, you don't really need it. You might need a block or two to support the head. If you're going to take
the forward flexion and the rounding through the back, you might want something to support your forehead. Not necessary though. So once we've got our legs in abduction, hips abducting, so moving away from the midline, with a nice, tall, relaxed spine, we'll bring that flexion back in, those of us that can take that rounded position. Tucking the chin, rounding through the back, and then bringing your head down to blocks or bolster if you should happen to get that far down. Coming into your first edges here. Again, palms turned up. Coming back into checking through the body and the breath. Making sure that we found an edge, but we didn't push too far into that area of resistance that we could no longer breathe. So if that's a problem, walk it back a bit. And then anchoring onto that breath here. Taking a quick check through some of those trouble spots like tops of shoulders, jaw, space between the eyebrows, tongue relaxed. Anchoring the mind onto the breath and finding your stillness. Feet are soft. Fingers curled in towards your palms. Start to notice where you feel sensations building in the body. So you could have many edges coming to your awareness here. It could be through the inner leg line, could be through the lower back or mid back or even upper back. Now, sometimes in these seated postures, we discover, especially this is our second time going into forward flexion through the back, that after we've been here a little bit, that we can sink just a little more, finding a new edge. Last 30 seconds here. This posture is called dragonfly or straddle. Last few breaths here. So lifting your forehead away from whatever was supporting it, if you were using props, and keeping that chin tucked. You're just going to walk your hands back towards your body. Slowly bringing that spine out of all that flexion. Untucking the chin at the very end. So let's take our props off to the side. Hands back behind our hips, slightly leaning back. And then bring one leg back to center and then the other. Taking a little bounce out here. So our last yin posture in this sequence is shoelace. And it's all about hip adduction. So you're not going to need a sit cushion for this one because it usually just becomes a bit uncomfortable. So take out any sit cushion or blanket. And we are going to bend through the right leg and take it more into the center of your mat. This is externally rotating this right hip yet again. And then we're going to lean off to the right and bring our left leg up and over top of that right leg. This also externally rotates the left hip, but we've just brought our hips in right towards the midline. So that's adduction. It's actually going to really target your outer hip area really well. These are your abductors and your hip stabilizers. The intention is to stack the knees as best you can. That will be dependent on how you're built through your hips. So if you're like me and your hips are further back and you've got lots of great hip external rotation, it will be more challenging to do hip adduction. Some people's hip sockets are more towards the front of their pelvis. It's very easy to do adduction. You can't change how you're built. If sitting in a full shoelace is just super uncomfortable, you're all off to one side, it's just not going to happen. You can do a half shoelace. Right leg will stay straight, left leg will tuck back. This is still hip adduction. Just going to do it one leg at a time. You're still going to target these outer hip muscles and fascia. So pick which one works for you. Try to find yourself as grounded and centered through both sit bones as you can. You have some options. You can hold your feet and sit nice and tall here and slightly tuck your chin. Or if you want to bring in that forward rounding flexion again and target more of your back at the same time, you will hug a knee or knees. Coming back into your breath. Let's do 30 more seconds here.
through your breaths. Nice and slow. If you've taken the forward fold, bring yourself back up to sitting upright, releasing head and neck, and then untangling those legs. Taking them out in front of you, hands back behind your hips, lean back and take a little shake out. So we need to do shoelace on the other side. So bending back through the left knee this time, letting it be more centered of your mat. And then leaning off to the left and bringing the right leg up and over. So again, if you're really tipped over to the left and it's just be very awkward and uncomfortable, do a half shoelace. Left leg straight, right leg tucked back. If you are taking the full shoelace, it may be that your knees don't stack at all. Mine don't, it's fine. We are still doing adduction of the hips, which is our target. We just want to try to be as grounded and centered through those sit bones as we can. You should be really starting to feel some sensations through the right outer hip area. And if you take the forward fold, which we're about to bring in, you're also going to feel it target up into your lower back. So again, options, you could just hold your feet, sit nice and tall and tuck your chin here. Or tucking the chin and rounding through the back, hugging your knees. Find which version of shoelace works for you here on this side. You might be really different on this side. So following those same 3 principles we always use in every posture. Find your edge. So that's an area of resistance where you start to feel sensation in the body, but it's sensation you can breathe into. Then find your stillness, anchoring onto the breath. Releasing any tension you're holding in the body. Softening on those exhales. And then staying for an adequate amount of time. Shoelace, most poses, 2 minutes is enough. But some poses, sometimes you want to stay in longer. So if you do any of these postures I've shown you in this sequence, you just decide to do a couple of them on any given day, you could stay in them up to 5, 10, 15 minutes if you wanted to. Last 30 seconds here.
Nice and slow. Bringing yourself out of the forward flexion. Untucking the chin at the very end. And then untying those legs from the shoelace. Legs extend down your mat. Hands come back behind your hips. And let's take a little bounce out here. Let's just pop down to those ankles for a moment and take some circles, both directions. And then point and flex the feet. So we did it, 6 degrees of movement through the hip socket. So now it's time for Shavasana. So finding your comfortable position. Again, for some, full Shavasana is a very comfortable place to release and let go. And for others, that's just not great on the lower back, so they could take Ardha Shavasana. Could also do knees touching, feet wide, in what we call constructive rest. I also know people that take Shavasana on their belly, so it is your choice. If you fully extend those legs, just let the feet flop open to the side and even have the legs a touch wider than hip distance. All of us release those shoulder blades to the earth. You should feel your collarbones broaden as you do that. Arms out, whatever height works for you. Back and hands grounded. Fingers gently curling in towards the palms. Slight tuck of the chin. And let's unclench those back teeth and release the tongue into lower palate of the mouth. Same way we moved into the practice, we just reverse ourselves out at the end. So let's bring ourselves back into an awareness of the breath. And what you should notice after you've spent some time in the practice, just so much easier to drop back into that diaphragmatic breath here at the very end. And we'll just take 3 cleansing breaths now, just to signal the end of the practice. So inhale through the nose. And then exhale it out with a sigh. Inhale, nose. Exhale, release. Last inhale. Imagine a wave of energy moves from the soles of the feet right up to the crown of the head. And when you exhale, you're going to completely empty those lungs and feel that wave of energy wash back down through the body, helping you to completely release and let go. Closing the mouth, unclenching the back teeth, softening the muscles through the cheeks and the temples, smoothing out those worry lines on the forehead. Eyes heavy in the sockets as the eyes close or gaze softens. Tops of the shoulders sliding away from the ears. Shoulder blades dense and heavy melting into your mat. Arms heavy like they're full of warm sand. Sacrum dense and heavy sinking into the earth.
Releasing all of those big muscles of the back and releasing the spine to the earth. Legs heavy, like they too are full of warm sand. Just letting the whole body get heavy. Whole back body is being supported by the earth. Nothing you need to do here. And just feel a softness through the belly, through the heart space, through the throat center. See if you can sense being both grounded and light at the same time. And let your awareness shift up into that space between your eyes, between your eyebrows. This is the third eye. And just notice here how there's stillness and quiet within. It should feel like coming home. And just let yourself rest here in this space, in this stillness. And stay here for as long as